Welcome to a special edition of the Air Force Doctrine podcast. My name is Nicholas Underwood. The LeMay Center, in partnership with MGM Works, is hosting an essay contest open to all civilian and uniformed airmen. Our essay prompt asks airmen to discuss how a specific U.S. Air Force doctrine will need to change or a new doctrine adopted due to the changing character of war expected over the next 10 years. As a kickoff event for the contest, this episode of the Air Force Doctrine podcast interviews Naval Postgraduate School Professor Emeritus Dr. John Arquilla on the changing character of war and its implications of Air Force operational doctrine. Dr. Arquilla is a Professor Emeritus of Defense Analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School and a former analyst at the RAND Corporation. He has served as an advisor to the Pentagon in numerous aspects, including as part of a team of analysts advising General Norman Schwarzkopf during the Gulf War. Dr. Arquilla is also a top author in many fields of interest to our listeners, including security affairs, irregular warfare, military transformation, and the implications of the information age for society and security. Among his most noted work is his explorations of cyber war, net war, and swarming. His most recent book, Blitzkrieg, The New Challenge of Cyber War, focuses on how the ability to quickly gather, fuse, and distribute information is key to the current and future of armed conflict. Here's my conversation with Dr. Arquilla. Dr. Arquilla, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Really glad you could have you on today. As we've talked, we're going to have an essay contest, and we're encouraging airmen of all ranks to analyze the character of war, look at Air Force doctrine, and try to utilize their experience to see how doctrine may have to change in the future or how we can better implement it in order to meet the challenges that we see in the current security environment. Can you explain to us what we mean when we say character of war and how has this changed over time?
Sure. And by the way, I think that's a terrific question for your essay prompt, particularly given that the Air Force has done so much to change the character of war over the past century. Basically, the character of war changes the way we fight, the way we operate, changes as technologies advance. And the aircraft, of course, is a profound instrument of military affairs that in its infancy, even in World War I, played a very substantial role. Had the war gone from 1918 into 1919, the battle plans all featured heavy uses of aircraft in close support of advancing ground units. And this was something that the Germans realized they, at that point, had little ability to deal with and played a big role in getting the armistice in November of 1918. Basically, new tools generally lead to new practices. It doesn't happen right away. The World War I example is one of a lot of new tools being used in old ways, and so there was a lot of deadlock for years. But the aircraft and the tank made a big difference late in the war, and certainly a generation later in World War II, advances in technology, particularly the power of the internal combustion engine, created a whole new character of operations that was based much more on maneuver than on positional warfare, far more on being able to outflank rather than to just butt heads mass on mass. I like to say there's always been four different forms of war that really form its character. Massing is, of course, one of the earliest forms, the phalanx, just a mass of Alexander's, 16-foot-long spear-driven infantry, able to plow through almost anything. But then there was also maneuver that emerged. These would be the Parthian horsemen, the Mongols, who were 100% mounted army. And they too had a doctrine called Crow Swarm, by the way, which meant attacking an opponent from all directions. And they used their mobility, their situational awareness, and the range of their bows, which outranged the Western archers considerably, that allowed them to do this sort of thing. Of course, when all that falls apart and combat becomes very confused, you simply have a melee, where it's like a barroom fight, but on a large scale. So in different periods of technological change, different aspects of this character, this four-part character of war manifest. In World War I, mass clearly mattered a great deal. In World War II, maneuver. I think in our era, we're moving much more toward a situation where swarm tactics are going to be important. I think in the war in Ukraine, We've seen the Ukrainians really persist and triumph to a great extent over Russian offensives because of their ability to hit them from all directions with small units, armed with smart munitions and swift flowing information. I think that's the three-part answer to what's happening to the character of war right now. And I believe we're going to see that in all aspects of land, sea, air, and even aerospace warfare.
That's very interesting. So we talk a lot here about technology allowing this flowing of information and maneuver. But in Blitzkrieg, you talk a lot about there's the technology race, but there's also this cognitive race. And I think that's the practices that you're talking about. Just wanted to pull on that thread a little bit.
Absolutely, a wonderful point. It's technology alone, new tools, without this cognitive edge will often lead to the persistence of old practices. Again, we go back to World War I with high explosive artillery and machine guns. All it did was reinforce a lot of old thinking. And so the troops on the Western Front in 1915 were massed shoulder to shoulder in their attacks, just as the infantry of Waterloo in 1815. So you have to be very careful at this cognitive level to realize that the new tools imply new practices and to get to those new practices. And it seems to me in the case of air power, we've seen this from the very beginning. General Billy Mitchell suggesting, for example, that ships at sea were going to be incredibly vulnerable in the future to air attack. And of course, he ran up against an organization that wasn't, let's say, at the cognitive edge and ended up being court-martialed. You know why? Because he used a bomb to sink the Ostfriesland that was a bit bigger than the one that he was allowed to by the regulations of the exercise. And he did some other things that spoke out quite a bit. Speaking of which, my comments reflect my views alone and do not represent Department of Defense policy.
Yes,
So,
sir.
yeah, this cognitive story is an important one, and I think it really is incumbent. And you know, I salute you for doing this podcast series, and I hope this sort of thing is going on throughout the Department of Defense, because we have to cultivate a turn of mind attuned to this age of technological change.
Absolutely agree with that. And part of the cognitive piece is not just we throw doctrine and things like organization into that as well, and we'll add how organization, not just the doctrine applied, but how you're organized to do so. We've talked separately about how air forces were organized throughout World War II. We see the what we could call penny packing done by the French with their air force through the interwar period, and not were very successful in World War II. And then you see the the U.S. Air Force moving away from that penny packing and getting to the decentralized execution. And so those pieces are what we really need our airmen to look at. How do we need to re-evolve our doctrine and organization?
Yeah, again, I think these are big aspects or manifestations of what it means to have an appropriate turn of mind. What does your doctrine look like? How are you organized to conduct operations under the changed conditions in the character of warfare? And as you know, I've argued for a long time that given the advances in information technology, we have a fundamental shift in military affairs that really can be summed up quite simply. The ages-old connection between range and accuracy has been decoupled. We now have all kinds of weaponry, particularly the Air Force, that can fire at great distances with high levels of accuracy. So what this means is that smaller and smaller fighting units have greater and greater disruptive and destructive power. And so this implies a whole new concept of operations and requires a kind of doctrinal exploration of the possibilities. In terms of what this means for organizational structures, I think it means, given the empowerment of small units because of the high accuracy of our systems, I think what it means is that we can have many more smaller units, what I call the many and the small, taking the place of the few and the large in military affairs. And I think that's the big organizational story. And as I say, I think this empowerment of the small groups allows us to swarm, to strike at many points simultaneously or in sequence, to do so in a way that overloads the adversary defenses. I think this will prove superior. We don't need to have massed formations of bombers
going over the Ruhr, for example, in World War II. We had to do that because of the lack of accuracy of the weapons. Even the Norden bomb sight only got bombs somewhere within a mile of the actual target if they were dropped from bombs were dropped from 20,000 feet. Well, now you can be 100 miles away or more and put something right through the window of a building. So the emphasis on mass is probably beginning to lessen. The emphasis on empowering as much as possible, as many small units as possible, and activating them together to strike in many, many places. I think this is a doctrinal innovation that we see this in some Air Force campaigns. As you mentioned, the American fighter bombers late in World War II were doing exactly this and entirely throwing German combat units and logistic supports into confusion and making in what was called the Falaise Gap, making a killing ground of it. By the way, the Red Air Force was doing something similar at the end of World War II as well. So we've seen this in my own involvements with the development of air-land battle back in the late 70s and early 80s, really tried to recapture that sense of being able to use this kind of swarming capability against the various echelons of what would be thought to be at the time Red Army advances from Central into Western Europe. So there are antecedents for all this. I think right now the technology is absolutely in place to allow us to do this.
That's interesting. You alluded to earlier the many and the few. As I recall, you've put forth 3 new rules of war, and you started to get into that. I would be interested to hear a little more.
Well, at an organizational level, because of this empowerment of the small group, we should be building militaries made up of a lot of little things rather than a few large things. So let's take the Navy, for example. Why would we want to concentrate huge amounts of our combat power in just 10 or 11 super aircraft carriers that, in an age of hypersonic missiles and supercavitation torpedoes and brilliant seagoing mines, we're really creating in various parts of the world single points of failure. So I think it makes good sense to move from the few and the large to the many and the small, and particularly because the small are so empowered by weapons accuracy. A second rule is that finding is the new flanking. In maneuver warfare, you want to pin down the opponent, turn his flank, and then roll him up. Today, the real challenge, and this is certainly a challenge for air power, both in conventional as well as in irregular warfare, is finding enemy forces. If you look back to the Kosovo War, the biggest challenge against the forces of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the Serbs, was finding them. And as we know, at an unclassified level from after-action studies of the war, very, very little damage was actually done to Yugoslavian forces. We really needed to set our special forces loose with the Kosovars to help identify where the little packets of Serbs were hiding to make for a better campaign. So finding, and as we know from 20 years in Afghanistan, finding is a big problem. So that's a great challenge. And air power, one of the biggest aspects of the future of air power is going to be the way in which it assists in the finding process, whether with drones, with orbital or suborbital assets, but creating the knowledge that becomes the fuel of future military operations is absolutely key. So that's the second new rule of war. Finding is the new flanking. And finally, at a doctrinal level, swarming is the new surging. We tried to solve our problems in Iraq and Afghanistan by surging forces. I think the real answer is not to bow to mass, which is what surging really is. It's sending more things in. Swarming says use what you have, use those many small units to attack simultaneously. And in fact, when things turned around in 2007 in Iraq, it was through, I had suggested at the time a system called outpost and outreach, create a lot of little outposts rather than a few big forward operating bases, which took a lot of time for troops to get off of to go where they were going. And these little outposts generated more information, helped with the finding, but they also reacted swiftly. They worked very closely with air support. And before you knew it,
terrorist attacks dropped by over 90% during 2007. And this was in the previous year, almost 40,000 innocent Iraqis had been killed by the insurgents. That was down by over 90% and stayed down really until the end of 2011 when, for reasons I still don't understand, we left Iraq to ISIS and to Iran. By the way, I'm still puzzled as to why we left Afghanistan. As you know from when we were together in class years ago, I thought was a bad idea. So this whole idea of using that new organizational structure of many and small to the optimum, engage most of them most of the time, that's the swarm, and that's going to matter a lot more than this notion of surging. Look, we see it in the victories of the Ukrainians in the opening campaign in their war with the Russians, and to this day, lots of small units. Their basic unit of action was squad-sized. And it's just amazing when you activate all of them, when you give them a lot of autonomy within an overall concept of operations, the results can be remarkable. I hope we do a little bit of talking about the issues of autonomy, control, centralization, and decentralization, because those are important themes too.
And that's actually where I want to go. A lot of, as you talk, it reminds me a lot of the work that Deploy did years ago, charting dispersion over the years, the distance between troops on the battlefield. And we see that happen. It happens World War I. They stayed fairly close together with disastrous results. World War II, we start to see that dispersion open up. And one of the things that enable this are these increased in communication capabilities. As we look at new concepts in the Air Force, such as agile combat employment, how do we execute swarming? There seems to be a very heavy command and control burden here. How do we communicate? How do we coordinate all of these forces together? Any ideas on how we can think about command and control in this new type of paradigm?
What we have to realize is that command and control served an absolutely essential function during the industrial age, right? Before industrialization, armies were relatively controllable from a single point during a single battle. Think of Napoleon at Austerlitz or Borodino, or even at Waterloo, although Waterloo things got a little more confusing for him. But you basically can have the great general observing everything. Well, with industrialization, the rise of rail, armies became much larger, were distributed over more space. And so the idea of keeping some kind of control over what was going on was essential to coherent military operations and to effectiveness in battle. The question now is whether that same paradigm of control that worked for industrial age militaries is still optimal for information age militaries. And here I think the technology cuts in two directions. One is that because connectivity is so ubiquitous, there can be an impulse to over-control. On the other hand, there's the possibility of holding the reins very, very loosely, perhaps too loosely, and things get confused. So finding the equilibrium, and I think the Air Force is working with what do you call it? The idea of distributed control. The idea that you're evolving away from classic command and control to something between that and absolute autonomy. And I think that's a very sensible move to make, and I'd like to see the other services moving in that direction. What we see in the business world is that there is something really that looks a lot like the mission orders of the elder Moltke in the 19th century, the Weisungen, in which he gave great trust to his field commanders and said, here's what we want to do. Keep me informed. We've got this telegraph. Let me know what's going on, and I'll let you know if how things are going and whether we may need to make any adjustments. And I think in the entire Franco-Prussian War, he only had to send something like 6 messages to different corps commanders, and it was a remarkable victory. So that's a good example. Moshe Dayan in 1967 in the Six-Day War, optional control is what the Israelis called it, something quite similar, and they won a remarkable victory. Interestingly, though, in 1973, the Israelis fell back a little more on centralization and did less well, by the way. I think that's an almost laboratory-like case. So, and I saw some of this in the Gulf War with the air tasking orders, which was at the time it was all printed out. So it was a burst of paper that was about 3.5 feet tall, twice a day, coming out of the black hole, and which is where the air tasking orders were put together. And then there were a number of assets that were simply let loose to seek targets of opportunity. And in close support, they did just exemplary work. Well, they created what Colin Powell called the highway of death, and give a sense of how disruptive they were on Iraqi forces. So I think, clearly we have to move beyond classical command and control. Distributed control sounds like a really good midpoint, but there's probably more we can do to move in line with classic concepts like Moltke's Weisungen or Dayan's optional control. Those are great historical examples of how command and decontrol, if you will work. And in the business world, they're doing a lot of that right now. And what the CEOs want is top sight on what's going on, but they give a lot of confidence and trust in their subordinates and simply say, look, if I think something needs adjusting, I'll let you know. It's very interesting at places like IBM and other very advanced and internationally interlinked companies, how light the hand of senior management is, of command is on business operations. And I think, the way you make your money is the way you make your wars. So I think there will be some similarities between commerce and military affairs in the years ahead.
Absolutely. As you talk about that, one of the recent words we've added to the Air Force lexicon has been around a while, but mission command. Here at the LeMay Center, we're really pulling apart mission command and looking at it through the airman's perspective, and a lot of that is based on the tenets that we've been pursuing since 1943. This idea of decentralized execution.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as you mentioned Moltke there, that really popped in my head. I was like, yeah, we're building a lot. And I would encourage any of our listeners to study the German General Staff, especially in regards to the mission command concepts, because there's a lot that we can learn looking at that. But as we've talked about mission command, one thing that Blitzkrieg really tunes me into is this additional need at the lower levels to communicate and coordinate. We saw that we recently did a podcast discussing the pullout of Afghanistan, the Kabul airlift. And it was amazing to me to hear about the coordination that was happening at the tactical level via cell phones or any means necessary. Your net war concept talks a lot about that particular communication and how new technology has enabled that. How much of these nodes of communication, these all-channel networks, as you call them, how much of a major factor you think this is going to play in the future?
Oh, I think it's going to be essential to military success in the future, and a cause of failure if you can't get there. You basically, first of all, have to have a lot of trust in your operators. They have to be, fully conversant with the concept of operations, the goals of the particular campaign. What are we doing in this conflict, et cetera? And the United States invests a tremendous amount in its human capital. We have non-commissioned officers doing things routinely that in militaries in other countries take colonels to do. So let's have some faith in our people. But I think you raise another very important point, and that's really about network design. Militaries traditionally have been very hierarchical, and it's one of the reasons that when there have been snafus that like getting out of Kabul in 2021, I'd say a lot of that has to do with vertical flows of information. In an information age, you want those flows to be lateral in nature. And so how do you design to do that? Well, I think the simplest way to do it would be to pursue this idea of distributed control. And that is, within these areas of distribution, there has to be lateral connection between all the units of action in that area. You don't want to have an all-channel network where everybody connects with everybody everywhere in a field of operations. But this idea of distributed control suggests that you can have little areas of all-channel connectivity which are then linked. Perhaps they become, you have a hub and spokes design. A lot of what I see in militaries today looks like hub and spokes, where there's a center and then lots of spokes radiating out from it, doing things. Well, think about having at the end of one of those spokes an area that spoke is actually an area where 10, 12, 20 units of action are all connected with each other, sharing information, accessing it quickly, and knowing what's going on. That will allow them to optimize their own operations and to do so very swiftly. When we first went into Afghanistan in 2000, in the fall of 2001, there were just 11 A teams there, less than 200 of our operators on the ground, but they were all connected on the tactical web page. And by the way, I think you remember Colonel Greenshields. Well, he was, heading the Special Operations Aviation at that time, and they were connected to him as well. And so this information, this was war by seconds and minutes, and that makes a very, very big difference. So network design is something that I think will fit very well with the concept of distributed control. And I think, among other things, it can greatly enhance the effectiveness of air campaigns. But those air campaigns, and most of the time, exist to support some sort of land operations. And so we have to think in terms of how this integrates with the overall war plan. And I hope we get to this a little bit, we really have to ask ourselves, are we conducting a campaign designed to wear down an opponent, or are we conducting a campaign to get to a specific place? So think about Iraq in the 2003 invasion. That was a sequential campaign: Thunder Run to Baghdad, overthrow Saddam Hussein. But what followed after that was a wearing down attritional campaign, where it's the cumulative effects of what we do. We're going to decide how things turned out. And thankfully, by 2007, we'd figured out how to wear down al-Qaeda in Iraq and drop their capabilities substantially. So when we think about that, and we think about this notion of all channel nodes within pods of distributed control, we have to ask ourselves, is this part of a campaign with a sequential goal, some place we're going to be, or is it something we're trying to do over time? Think of what the Russians tried to do in Ukraine. They tried a sequential campaign, a rush at Baghdad, but they got swarmed by the Ukrainians and stopped there. Now they're engaged in a campaign, basically a strategic air campaign, right, with drones and missiles to try to wear down the will of the Ukrainians, destroy their infrastructure, and the ground fighting looks very attritional as well. So, if the whoever's going to win this is going to have to figure out how to optimize the use. And it looks to me like actually air capabilities are going to make a very, very big difference. You have to ask yourself, why hasn't Russian close air support worked better? And part of that, if I may digress for a moment, part of that is really a story about the accuracy of weaponry, right? Throughout most of history, when you hurled a weapon at your opponent, you were hurling a certain amount of mass with all the energy you could. And that, translated same thing to the days of artillery that began about 700 years ago. Well, today, you don't just hurl mass and energy, you now hurl mass, energy, and information. And that's, I think, going to be a key difference here. And I know the Ukrainian, and this is true for the Ukrainian ground forces as well as their air defense forces, the intelligence of the anti-air weapons that the Ukrainians have in their hands, thanks to us and other allies, has made it very hard for the Russians to use air power that's so essential to their own blitzkrieg doctrine, right? And it seems to me that this is the crux of the campaign. If the Russians can't figure out how to do effective combined arms operations, even under General Gerasimov, who's just taken over in theater now. They're going to fail again. And conversely, the sheer amount of smart weaponry increasingly in the hands, from HIMARS to attack drones to all the ISR the Ukrainians are getting, their many and small units are absolutely going to be able to swarm the Russians out of the areas they've taken. And it seems to me, stand by. It's going to get very, very interesting. And the key, the crux, of course, is this whole notion of the information content of weaponry, from which all these other implications we've been talking about flows.
That's phenomenal. As we think through that, how much of a change due to the change in this character of war, how is this affecting how we integrate with other campaign plans?
Well, it's going to be interesting in case we do get into a major war with a technologically advanced opponent. One of the critical questions for joint operations is going to be the extent to which we are able to provide close air support. Let's just give an example here from Vietnam. The whole idea of air mobility. I know the helicopters were Army and Marine helicopters, but that was the use of air mobility. In my day, it was called vertical envelopment when I was an enlisted man. And the whole idea there was that this technology was going to create a tactical mobility the enemy couldn't cope with. But guess what? The enemy had good air defenses and shot down 4,000 helicopters in Vietnam, and had good air defenses, by the way, against strategic bombing in the north. So there's an example of a situation where, in a kind of joint campaign mindset, we were unable to do the things that we had theorized about doing precisely because of the enemy's capabilities in air defense. And what we're seeing in the Russo-Ukraine war, which I think is a lot like serves the function of the Spanish Civil War before World War II, right? Tanks and planes were all pioneered in the Spanish Civil War. Well, in the Russo-Ukrainian war, we're seeing a lot of pioneering in terms of swarms, but also air defenses. And I'm a little concerned about our ability to work at a tactical level with close air support, maybe even battlefield interdiction of enemy forces. So that's going to be a very, very interesting challenge. And it raises the question about whether we need to think about the use of air power in such settings through the lens of platforms or through the lens of weapons. Maybe if air defenses are so good, sort of what are they calling them in the naval air context, the anti-area, air denial, area denial. If that's the case, maybe we need to become more weapon-centric than platform-centric and be, as the Russians, by the way, are doing with their aircraft now, right? They're shooting missiles from aircraft that are well inside the Russian border because they're afraid to go over Ukrainian airspace. So maybe a very different kind of close support, maybe we'll call it not so close support in the future. So it seems to me that that's one of the big implications for joint operations. The other is, if we achieve and sustain air mastery of one sort or another, whether superiority or supremacy in a theater, the ability of ground forces to operate in very small numbers becomes greatly increased. So I see that as another key aspect in the relationship in joint operations, where air power becomes the fulcrum of the land operations. And that, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial as we move ahead. And it raises, and I know we haven't talked about this yet, but it raises the question about how to gain that superiority. We think a lot in terms of suppression of enemy air defenses, and that's a good thing, but of course becoming more and more difficult in an age of very smart weapons. What happens when the enemy air defenses include a lot of autonomous air vehicles whose job is simply to kamikaze into our aircraft? The use of AI is something that I think is going to have profound implications for air power in the 21st century in terms of the character of air warfare. In particular, I think in land warfare, we're going to see less impact of autonomous fighting vehicles or systems. But in air warfare, I think AI is going to be very powerful. I don't know how closely the Air Force has studied the DeepMind experiment. This is an AI that went up against the Top Gun fighter pilot 3 years ago they did 5 dogfights, and the AI, using the same simulator of the same aircraft, and the AI shot down the Top Gun 5 times and never sustained a hit of its own. Well, take that to the next step, which is if you have just AI aircraft, you can design them well beyond the tolerances of the human body. And places like China and Russia don't care about the ethics of air warfare, that somehow AIs might go rogue and do something, really, really bad. They don't mind making these things full autonomous. We're going to be always very careful about that. So one of the things I suggested in my book, and thanks for mentioning it, is that just like moving from command and control to distributed control is a way station, we should do the same thing with AI and begin to build squadrons that have a mix of human pilots, drone pilots, and AIs, with, in that little pod, the squadron commander having the ability, in case the AI goes haywire, of detonating that plane, have some kind of fail safes in those settings. But I think it's time to begin blending in artificial intelligence. We're moving into 21st century. Will be an age of war, increasingly populated by intelligent machines, and it seems to me that too is going to have a fundamental impact on the character of warfare.
That's interesting, and one of the things you speak a lot about it is technology strategy, and we started stumbling into that a little bit there. You talked about weapon-centric versus platform-centric, and you even mentioned drones as kamikazing into other aircraft, and it seems the character of air warfare in general is changing. What the air fight will actually look like, I think, is your big point there. We may not have 6th, 7th generation fighters going against each other in the traditional sense. We may have an entirely different character playing out. And so if that's the case, this concept of or this idea of technology strategy needs to look entirely different as we go forward. Did you want to pull on that a little bit?
Absolutely. It's an excellent point. And for your listeners, I just want to say that Major Underwood wrote a brilliant thesis for me on the issue of technology strategy, and everyone should tug on that and have a look at it. What kind of Air Force, what kind of military do we want to build? Well, I think if one of the new rules of war is many and small beats few and large, maybe what you want to do is take some of your funding and set that aside to build a lot of little things. Right now, our military across the services is heavily invested in relatively small, super aircraft carriers. What's the cost of the F-35, for example, and how would relatively small numbers of those expensive platforms do against swarms of enemy AIs just seeking to kamikaze them? It's I think something that we want to be able to use our own swarms to counter what will undoubtedly be AI swarms coming from forces from either China or Russia. Frankly, the Iranians do a series of naval exercises called Great Prophet. They have some, from the Shah's days, they have some larger old vessels left, and they use those to portray the American Navy. And in each of these Great Prophet exercises, they swarm them with these kamikazes and score countless hits on them, and basically sink the proxy American fleet in every one of these exercises. By the way, the Iranians' term for it is ezba, which in Farsi it means saturation, but it sounds like a swarm of bees. So look, when we need a technology strategy, we first realize that everything comes at opportunity cost. If you're doing one thing, you may not be able to do something else. And that's why I suggest that we have to put our strategic caps on right away, long before we even start thinking about operational plans in this or that theater of operations. We have to think in terms of the character of warfare and what it implies for the kind of force in which we should invest. As you know, I spent a lot of time doing research on why the Germans built a fleet that looked, before World War I, that looked just like the Royal Navy, and only built a couple of submarines, when at a time the submarine was undetectable when submerged, and almost won the war, even with just a handful of submarines they had. Why was the technology strategy, which was pursued by the Germans for 20 years before the shooting started, why did they choose the few and the large instead of a lot of small submarines? So, and you can go on and on. You've written beautifully about the French choice to build the kind of aircraft they did that were almost utterly unsuited for the character of war that emerged in 1939 and 1940. So, yeah, what's our technology strategy? When is that discussed, and where is it discussed? I think in the Department of Defense, there's not a single place that's designated that by name. There's a lot of testing and research and development, but who are the technology strategists? Who beside you? Anyway, it's thanks for bringing it up. It's a crucial issue, and I think it touches on something else that you and I have discussed in the past and more recently. To be a good technology strategist, you have to have an understanding of what is the state of things, the unchanging state of things. What are the constants? What are the emerging trends? And what are the possible shocks that could come at us? And I don't know if you want to chat about that, if we have time to do that, but I'd love to say a few words about that too.
Yep, I definitely want to get to that. I'll add one of my own points, if a major is allowed to do so, is that Donald Rumsfeld, a bit of a controversial character, but he's famous as saying, "You go to war with the military you have, not the military you want." And I think for our listeners, when we think about technology strategy, you have to think even further behind than that. You have to think about, I'm going to war with the military I decided to have 20 years ago. And that's why, as we look in technology strategy, it's generally a much longer process, and you have to be thinking far, far ahead.
Yeah, a very wise man who worked for Franklin Delano Roosevelt on a defense committee before World War II said to the committee members in the proceedings of one of the meetings, he said, gentlemen, and at the time they were all men, gentlemen, wars begin 10 years before the shooting starts. And he said that back in 1936. And of course, we had only 5 years between then and Pearl Harbor. So we were didn't have our full decade. We probably would have had a lot more carriers if the war hadn't happened until 1946. War begins 10 years before the shooting starts. And I think that's why technology strategy is so important.
So to get to the point that you were talking about in terms of looking how to analyze this character of war and how to apply this, for somebody sitting down going, okay, I want to compete in this contest, and I think I'm knowledgeable in this particular doctrine. How do I look at that character of war? What's kind of a framework to help me understand how these changes will affect the way I operate or the way my organization operates? So you started by saying something about constants, trends, and shocks.
Yeah, certainly the technology strategist, but I think for strategists overall, a good question to ask is, what is unchanging in the character of war? What stays the same from where we've been to where we are to where we may be going? What are emerging trends? What are we beginning to see out there? And what might absolutely shock us? And shocks can come in two ways. One can be an absolute bolt from the blue that you didn't expect. And the other shock can be simply a dam bursting effect of just there's been pressure building up for years, and finally the dam bursts and the effects are catastrophic. So to give examples of shocks, certainly Pearl Harbor was a shock in terms of, even though Billy Mitchell had said surface ships are vulnerable to air attack, and we had some aircraft carriers of our own, although we had 3 times as many battleships as carriers in 1941. It was the shock that said, okay, the aircraft carrier is now the capital ship in naval warfare. That was a huge shock out of the blue. A dam bursting shock, I'd say, comes after World War II, when all the various colonial powers, from the British Empire to the French to anyone who had influence over others' territories and other peoples, had to come up against this notion of insurgency And it basically destroyed colonial control around the world in a period of decades. And of course, the United States becomes embroiled in Vietnam, which started as an anti-colonial war. And even we couldn't stop that. The dam had burst, and the power of the people was to be recognized. And the only really technological element in all of that was the AK-47, a weapon that just worked really, really well and powered individuals in all kinds of settings everywhere. What are trends that are out there? Well, in our time, the biggest trend has been the increasing information content of weaponry, right to the point where sometimes a weapon can be entirely autonomous, not just remotely controlled. So that's a trend. Whether will that lead to a shock? I think the potential would be in a major war with an advanced power to see our manned aircraft all attacked by autonomous swarms. That's the latter day Pearl Harbor. And it seems to me that would be a tremendous shock. What about constants? When I look at the American military, I see, of that nearly 900 billion defense budget, a great deal of it is allocated to what I would refer to as the constants. The aircraft carriers, the advanced fighter aircraft, basically all the suite of tools in the land forces, the Marines, the amphibious assault ships, et cetera. The whole paradigm is based on the idea that a great deal of what has been will continue to be. And it seems to me that good technology strategy should demand of us to think about how the existing trends may lead to some kind of shock. Will there come a dam bursting moment where we know AI is on the rise? Will it have as profound an effect in the 21st century as the aircraft itself did in the 20th century? That, it seems to me, is essential. For those who are writing their essays on the changing character of war and what it implies, particularly for the Air Force, I think this point about AI is probably something that speaks to the issue of a really fast-moving trend that may lead to a shock in the future. In any event, there are some constants even in air power. Right? The B-52 is the world's greatest constant, right? It's, if you think in terms of being weapon-centric rather than platform-centric, maybe you don't need to get rid of older aircraft. Maybe you don't need the most advanced aircraft. If the answer is very, very smart weapons, or even small drone swarms that can be unleashed from aircraft. These are, cutting edge concepts that I think the trend line shows that capability is not too far off from this initial design period. I know at the Naval Postgraduate School we've experimented with swarms of 50 on 50 fighting an attacking swarm of 50 being intercepted by a counter swarm. And for those who don't know, our school has controlled airspace at Fort Hunter Liggett and a couple hours away from Monterey, and which, by the way, is not totally submerged right now. I know people are going to be hearing this at different times, but we're recording this in the middle of a series of bomb cyclones. We're getting swarmed by cyclones these past few weeks and today, but thankfully the power has stayed on, so I'm grateful for that.
That's good to hear. As you talk about constants, one of the things doctrinally that I always worry about, we're very clear that doctrine is not dogma. But very often throughout history, we have seen that an assumed constant can produce a self-induced shock. The one that pops in my mind is the bomber will always get through. Is there some additional examples that you think through of poorly assumed constants, maybe present now, that we should really be watching out for?
Well, I think your example of the bomber will always get through is a beautiful one, and it led to the doctrine of close formation daylight bombing, right? And the design of the flying fortress, the whole notion that mass still mattered. That was the constant, right, going into World War II. And pretty soon we realized that small fighter, swift fighter aircraft were going to inflict unacceptable losses on mass daylight bombers. And of course, why did they come up with this idea? Well, yes, the notion of the bomber will always get through, But what was driving it was the larger strategic goal of bombing with accuracy. The British gave up on this because they didn't even have flying fortresses or a concept, and their early daylight bombing raids were absolutely decimated. So they just went to area bombing at night, which was tremendously destructive, but usually not of war-making capacity. So the Americans wanted to bomb in daylight for greater accuracy and came up with a doctrine that, well, mass is a constant in warfare, so we're going to mass these guys together in bomber formations. And they did so against horrific losses, and then realized that, well, the best way, and what was happening, they were actually getting swarmed by Luftwaffe fighter squadrons, so they created a counter swarm in fighter escorts, in particular the long-range P-51 with the drop tanks that allowed bombers to be escorted to and from targets. And by being able to create a counter swarm, they were able to deal with the problem. So there's a case where something emergent helped to support something that was an assumed constant. And by the end of the war, of course, these mass formations were just bombing Germany into rubble. Now, I think what Stanley Baldwin said back in 1932 about the bomber always getting through is, clearly in an age of very, very smart weaponry in the air and in terms of air defenses based on the ground, it's going to be a lot harder. And so the trend line is clearly away from massed formations to more distributed formations. And the trend may even be to, as the Russians are suggesting, to launch smart weapons, air-launched cruise missiles and other weapons from a distance. And that may be the new norm. Because I think if we assume constants in air power about the ability to penetrate, we're probably going to end up in a high casualty shock, much as happened to the B-17s in their early campaigns in World War II.
So we've covered a number of interesting points from your book, Blitzkrieg. Were there any other revelations that you wanted to cover from your work in Blitzkrieg or from any of your other writings?
Thank you, first of all, for mentioning Blitzkrieg, and I hope readers will find some value in it. But let me also suggest, we've mentioned World War II, the period leading up to it, the issues of technology strategy. A couple of years ago, I wrote another book called Why the Axis Lost. The basic argument is that they were pretty poor technology strategists. And that's what hurt them the most. They didn't lose simply because they were up against greater numbers. Their early conquests gave them a kind of material parity with their opponents. But for example, let's just think of the Japanese Zero fighter plane in 1941. That was the best fighter plane in the world. But it came at some design choices that created vulnerabilities. It had the greatest range, swiftest maneuverability, but to do that, it was only lightly armored. In fact, did not have self-sealing fuel tanks, and had a tendency to blow up. American aircraft were slower, less maneuverable, but could take a lot more battle damage, and utterly defeated the Zero. And that's really why the Pacific War, changes so radically, so swiftly. It really was the air equation. So there's still a lot to learn from the design approach of militaries in World War II. And we haven't talked much about design yet, but I think that's really, really important to think like a designer. A designer is a problem solver. How do we get through air defenses, et cetera? What is the problem we face in the field? And how do we design a way around it? And design is not only with technology, it's also with organization. Maybe, we deal with the challenges we face by creating a lot of smaller units of action. Or maybe the answer is in doctrine. Maybe not simply mass or flanking attacks, but maybe swarm attacks are out there. Look, I'm extremely grateful for having the opportunity to share some thoughts on this podcast. And I just want to close my own comments, if I assume we're getting near the end here. We're over an hour, by coming back to the issue of shocks. And I hope the essay writers will think and come up with a shock we haven't thought of. How about that? What is something that could hit us by absolute surprise? or what is out there that's building up pressure and is going to burst the dam in the near future. I hope in some of these essays we learn of some fresh concerns to which we can focus our attention and hopefully prevent.
So, Dr. Arquilla, really appreciate having you here today. This has been tremendous. Hopefully provide our listeners a great deal of information, whether they choose to write in this contest or not. But I'll here in conclusion, I'll throw the mic back over to you. And if there's anything, any final thoughts you have.
I guess something that I always try to tell myself is approach whatever problem you're looking at with a sense of humility. And that takes me back to something that the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, said 80 years ago in the early days of World War II, when America had just been shocked at Pearl Harbor. He gave a public speech in which he said, quote, "Modern warfare is an intricate business about which no one knows everything and few know very much," close quote. I think as we try to look at the future, we look through a glass darkly. And so we have to realize we may catch glimpses of what's coming, and our job is to try to see as much as we can, to be careful about making big bets about what we think we see and hedging against possibilities and alternatives. I think as we look at the future of military affairs, this idea of there are times when you want to make a big bet on something, like Admiral Tirpitz made a big bet on German battleships before World War I. Wrong bet. Or hedging, being able to play in a number of different ways, from conventional to irregular warfare, from sequential type campaigns to attritional cumulative campaigns, being broadly prepared versus placing all your chips on red, let's say. So I leave you with that thought from Secretary Knox, and my hope that together we may all create a kind of collective intelligence that puts together a mosaic that gives us, in the end, a very good sense of what's coming in the future. And again, thank you so very much for involving me in this podcast.
That's going to do it for our special edition of the Deciphering Doctrine podcast. Special thanks to MGM Works and AUIX for sponsoring our essay contest. Contest details can be found at mgmworks.org. That's https://mgmwerx.org. We look forward to reading your essays. And as a final note, the views reflected on this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the LeMay Center, MGM Works, Air University, or the Department of Defense. I'm Nicholas Underwood. We will see you next time.